to provide the financial support that the crown desperately needed. While the common people who bore the burden of increased taxes grew restive under the weight of royal demands, the prosperity that had characterized the early Targaryen period seemed like a distant memory. The Blackfyre rebellions began during this period of weakness, as descendants of legitimized bastards pressed claims to the Iron Throne that found support among lords dissatisfied with Targaryen rule. Daemon Blackfyre, the great bastard who had been legitimized by King Aegon IV on his deathbed, represented everything that the legitimate Targaryens had lost. He was tall and strong and charismatic, skilled with sword and lance, possessed of the silver gold hair and purple eyes that marked true dragon blood. When he raised his standard in rebellion, calling himself the rightful king, many lords flocked to his banner. The first Blackfyre rebellion split the kingdom once again, though thankfully without the presence of dragons to multiply the destruction. The Battle of Redgrass Field became the decisive engagement where Daemon Blackfyre fell along with his twin sons, their deaths ending the immediate threat, but not the underlying causes of discontent. The Blackfyre cause would continue to smolder for generations, erupting into open rebellion whenever royal authority seemed weak, or when foreign powers sought to destabilize the Targaryen dynasty. King Daeron II, called the Good, represented a brief return to effective Targaryen rule through his marriage to Maria Martell of Dawn. This union finally brought the last of the Seven Kingdoms into the royal fold, ending centuries of Dornish independence through diplomacy rather than conquest. The integration of Dawn required delicate handling, as the proud princes of the Desert Realm insisted on maintaining many of their traditional laws and customs. The success of this peaceful unification showed that the Targaryens could still achieve great things when they relied on wisdom rather than force. Yet even this triumph carried the seeds of future problems, as the Dornish marriage brought foreign influences into the royal court that many traditional Westerosi lords viewed with suspicion. The customs of Dawn, including their more egalitarian approach to inheritance and their tolerance for bastards, conflicted with established Westerosi practices. The children born of the royal marriage carried both Targaryen and Martell blood, creating new complexities in the succession that would trouble future generations. The reign of Aerys marked another low point in Targaryen fortunes, as the scholarly king proved more interested in books and manuscripts than in the practical business of ruling. His neglect of governmental affairs allowed ambitious lords to pursue their own agendas, while the crown's authority continued to erode. The great spring sickness that swept through Westeros during his reign killed tens of thousands and demonstrated the monarchy's inability to protect its subjects from natural disasters. The king's own death from the plague seemed to symbolize the dynasty's helplessness in the face of forces beyond its control. The succession of Maekha brought military competence back to the throne, but his reign was marked by continued rebellions and the ongoing challenge of maintaining royal authority without dragons. The Second Blackfyre Rebellion, though unsuccessful, showed that the underlying tensions in the realm remained unresolved. The king's harsh methods of suppressing dissent alienated many lords who might otherwise have supported the crown, while his military campaigns drained the treasury and exhausted the kingdom's resources. The tragedy at Summerhall, where King Aegon Fee and Prince Duncan perished in the flames that consumed the royal summer palace, became a symbol of Targaryen hubris and the price of attempting to restore the family's lost glory. The king's obsession with hatching dragon eggs, using wildfire and dark magic in his desperate attempts to bring the great beasts back to life, resulted in a conflagration that killed much of the royal family and destroyed one of their most beautiful residences. The irony that Targaryens, who had once commanded dragonfire, should die in flames of their own making was not lost on those who chronicled the dynasty's decline. The reign of Jaehaerys II was brief but significant. As the king attempted to restore royal prestige to traditional means of statecraft and marriage alliances, his efforts to strengthen ties with the great houses through carefully arranged marriages showed a pragmatic understanding of the new realities of Targaryen rule. However, his reign was overshadowed by the growing threat from across the Narrow Sea, where the exiled Blackfyre pretenders continued to plot their return with the support of foreign powers. The War of the Nine Penny Kings brought the Blackfyre threat to a climax, as Me the Monstrous led a coalition of exiles and sellswords in an attempt to conquer Westeros. The royal response, led by Prince Aerys and his friends, successfully repelled the invasion, but at great cost. The victory at the Stepstones eliminated the last of the Blackfyre male line, but demonstrated how vulnerable the kingdom remained to external threats. The young princes who fought in the war, including the future Mad King Aerys II, were shaped by the violence they witnessed and the responsibilities thrust upon them. The cultural changes that accompanied the dynasty's political decline were equally significant, as the realm gradually adapted to life without dragons. The songs and stories that had once celebrated Targaryen greatness began to take on a more melancholy tone, focusing on past glories rather than present achievements. The great tournaments and festivals that had marked the height of royal power became smaller and less frequent, while the courtly culture that had flourished under earlier kings grew more introspective and pessimistic. The faith of the Seven, which had been carefully managed by earlier Targaryen kings, began to reassert its independence as royal power weakened. The High Septons of this period were less willing to bend to royal will, while the militant orders that had been suppressed after the Faith militant uprising began to reorganize in more subtle forms. The relationship between Crown and Faith, once a source of mutual support, became increasingly strained as religious leaders questioned the divine right of kings who no longer commanded supernatural power. The great noble houses that had once trembled before Targaryen dragons now began to assert their own authority more boldly. The Starks of Winterfell, the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, and the other major families started to act more like independent powers than mere subjects of the Iron Throne. Regional conflicts that would once have been quickly suppressed by royal intervention were allowed to fester, creating instability that weakened the kingdom's overall unity and strength. The economic decline that had begun with the Dance of Dragons continued throughout this period as the lack of royal authority made trade more difficult and expensive. Pirates and bandits operated with greater impunity, while the great trading companies that had once flourished under royal protection began to look elsewhere for security and profit. The crown's attempts to raise revenue through increased taxation only made the problem worse, as overtaxed merchants and farmers had less capital to invest in productive activities. The military reforms that had once made the royal army the most effective force in Westeros were gradually abandoned, as the crown could no longer afford to maintain professional soldiers. The feudal levies that replaced them were less disciplined and less reliable, while the lack of dragons meant that even large armies could be challenged by determined opponents. The Royal Navy, once the terror of the Narrow Sea, was reduced to a fraction of its former strength, as the crown could no longer afford to build and maintain the great warships that had projected Targaryen power across the known world. The intellectual and artistic decline that accompanied the political weakening of the dynasty was perhaps the most subtle but ultimately most damaging aspect of the period. The great libraries that had been accumulated by scholarly kings were neglected or destroyed, while the patronage that had supported artists and musicians was reduced or eliminated entirely. The loss of knowledge and culture that resulted from this neglect impoverished the entire kingdom, creating a generation that was less educated and less cultured than their predecessors. As the Targaryen dynasty entered what would prove to be its final century of rule, the signs of terminal decline were visible to anyone willing to see them. The kings who sat the Iron Throne were shadows of their ancestors, lacking both the supernatural power that had elevated their house and the political skills necessary to rule effectively without it. The kingdom they governed was increasingly fractured and rebellious, held together more by habit and inertia than by any genuine loyalty to the crown. The wheel of history continued to turn, carrying the once mighty Targaryen dynasty toward a doom that many could sense but few dared to name. The Game of Thrones was entering a new phase, one in which the ancient rules no longer applied, and new players would soon emerge to challenge the established order. The age of decline was ending, but what would replace it remained shrouded in mystery and speculation. The madness that would define the final years of Targaryen rule did not descend upon King Aerys II all at once, but crept into his mind like poison seeping through cracked stone, slowly corrupting everything it touched, until reason itself became the enemy. In his youth, Aerys had been everything a king should be: handsome and charismatic, brave in battle and clever in council, beloved by lords and small folk alike. The prince who had fought valiantly in the War of the 90 Kings and charmed the court with his wit and wisdom seemed destined for a golden reign that would restore the Targaryen dynasty to its former glory. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, with small eccentricities that his friends and advisors dismissed as the harmless quirks of genius. Aerys became increasingly suspicious of those around him, seeing plots and conspiracies where none existed, interpreting innocent gestures as signs of treachery. His famous friendship with Tywin Lannister, forged in their youth and strengthened through years of shared trials, began to sour as the king's paranoia grew. Where once he had trusted Tywin above all others, now he saw his hand as a potential rival whose competence and popularity threatened the royal prerogative. The defiance of Duskendale marked the true beginning of the king's descent into madness, though its full extent would not become apparent for years to come. When Lord Darklin of Duskendale refused to pay certain taxes and imprisoned the king during what should have been routine negotiations, Eris experienced a terror and helplessness that shattered something fundamental in his psyche. The rescue, mounted by Sir Barristan Selmy, saved the king's life, but could not repair the damage done to his mind during those months of captivity and uncertainty. After Duskendale, the king, who had once been known for his easy laughter and quick wit, became increasingly withdrawn and erratic. He refused to allow his hair or fingernails to be cut, believing that steel near his person invited assassination. His once handsome appearance deteriorated as he grew thin and wild-looking, his silver-gold hair becoming a tangled mess that reached nearly to his feet. The purple eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence now burned with a feverish intensity that made even his closest courtiers uncomfortable. The king's growing obsession with wildfire became the most visible sign of his deteriorating mental state. Where his ancestors had commanded dragons, Ares became fascinated with the green flames that burned so hot they could melt steel and stone. He spent hours watching alchemists prepare their volatile substances, delighting in the destructive potential of their creations. The Guild of Alchemists, long a minor institution in King's Landing, suddenly found themselves elevated to positions of influence and importance as the king sought ever more potent forms of the substance he called his dragonfire. The deterioration of Eris's relationship with his queen, Rayla, reflected the broader corruption of his character during this period, where once he had been a loving husband, he became increasingly violent and unpredictable. His treatment of his sister wife growing so harsh that even the court that had witnessed decades of Targaryen eccentricity was shocked. The queen bore the visible marks of his abuse, while her miscarriages and stillbirths became testament to the dysfunction that had infected the royal household. Only the birth of Prince Viserys offered any hope for the future of the dynasty. Tywin Lannister's resignation as Hand of the King marked a turning point in both the reign and the kingdom's history. The man who had served the crown faithfully for 20 years, transforming the realm's finances and governance with his ruthless efficiency, could no longer tolerate the king's increasingly erratic behavior. His departure removed the last check on heresy's worst impulses, while also depriving the crown of its most capable administrator. The insult the king delivered at Tywin's farewell, suggesting that he had always been a servant rather than a friend, ensured that the former Hand would harbor a personal grudge against the Targaryen dynasty. The king's paranoia reached new heights with his conviction that enemies surrounded him on all sides, plotting his downfall and the destruction of his family. He saw treason in every shadow and conspiracy in every conversation, turning the Red Keep into a prison where trust was a luxury that no one could afford. The small council meetings that had once been forums for serious discussion of policy became exercises in fear management, as counselors learned to tell the king only what he wanted to hear, rather than what he needed to know. The burning of Lord Rickard Stark and the strangulation of his heir Brandon became the axe that transformed royal eccentricity into open tyranny. When the young Stark Lord came to King's Landing, demanding justice for his sister's alleged abduction by Prince Rhaegar. He was arrested on charges of plotting against the crown. The trial by combat that followed was a mockery of justice, with fire serving as the king's champion. While Brandon strangled himself, trying to save his father from the flames. The sight of a great lord of the north being burned alive while his son died trying to reach him shocked even those who had grown accustomed to royal brutality. The demand for the heads of Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark was the final straw that broke the already strained loyalty of the great houses. Jon Arryn, the Lord of the Vale, who had fostered both young men, faced an impossible choice between honor and survival. His decision to call his banners in defiance of royal command sparked the rebellion that would bring down the Targaryen dynasty, as three of the most powerful regions of Westeros united against a king they could no longer tolerate or trust. Robert's rebellion, as history would remember it, was fought not just against a king, but against the entire system of absolute monarchy that had governed Westeros for 3 centuries. The rebels represented a new vision of governance, one where the power of kings was limited by law and custom rather than merely by their own conscience and wisdom. The battles that followed would determine not just who sat the Iron Throne, but what kind of kingdom Westeros would become in the future. The Battle of the Trident became the decisive engagement of the war, where Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the heir to the throne, who had been seen as the dynasty's best hope for redemption, fell beneath Robert Baratheon's warhammer. The prince's death in the Ruby Ford of the Trident symbolized the end of the Targaryen dream of restoration, as their most capable leader perished trying to defend a father whose madness had made the crown itself a source of instability and fear. As news of defeat reached King's Landing, Aerys's madness reached its final, most destructive phase. Convinced that enemies were closing in on all sides and that his reign was doomed, he commanded the pyromancers to place caches of wildfire throughout the city. His plan was simple and terrible. If he could not rule King's Landing, then no one would, and the entire population would burn along with him in a final conflagration that would deny his enemies the prize they sought. The king's last words, "Burn them all," became the epitome for a dynasty that had once commanded dragons and ruled the known world. Spoken to Rosset, the chief pyromancer who had helped place wildfire throughout the city. They represented the final surrender of sanity to the madness that had consumed the last Targaryen king. Only the intervention of Cersei Lannister, who killed both the king and his pyromancer before they could ignite the city, prevented the capital from becoming a funeral pie for 500,000 people. The death of Aerys II in the throne room of the Red Keep, stabbed in the back by a knight of his own king's guard, was as inglorious as his reign had been tragic. A man who had once seemed destined for greatness died alone and unmourned, his body left on the cold stone floor, while the city he had tried to destroy celebrated its salvation. The golden hand that had once worn the rings of office was stained with blood, while the Iron Throne itself seemed to reject its last Targaryen occupant. The sack of King's Landing that followed Robert's victory was brutal and thorough, as years of accumulated resentment against Targaryen rule found expression in violence and destruction. The royal family that had once seemed untouchable was scattered or destroyed, with Princess Alia and her children murdered by Lannister troops, eager to prove their loyalty to the new regime. The wealth that the Targaryens had accumulated over 3 centuries of rule was looted or destroyed, while the symbols of their power were torn down or defaced. The discovery of the wildfire caches hidden throughout the city served as a final revelation of how close the kingdom had come to total destruction. The green flames that Aerys had intended as his legacy were carefully removed and disposed of. But the knowledge of how near the city had come to annihilation haunted those who learned the truth. The Mad King's final plan represented the ultimate expression of the Targaryen motto, fire and blood, turned not against enemies, but against the very people they had sworn to protect. The escape of Prince Viserys and the pregnant Queen Rhaella to Dragonstone ensured that the Targaryen bloodline would survive, though in exile rather than glory. The birth of Princess Daenerys during the storm that gave her the nickname Stormborn provided a final irony. As the dynasty's last hope was born on the ancestral seat that had witnessed its rise to power centuries earlier, the children who fled across the narrow sea carried with them the dreams and ambitions of their ancestors, but also the burden of their father's madness and the crimes committed in their family's name. The fall of the Targaryen dynasty was not just a political revolution, but a cultural transformation that changed the very nature of Westerosi society. The absolute monarchy that had existed since Aegon's conquest was replaced by a more limited form of kingship, where the great houses retained significant autonomy, and the crown ruled by consent rather than fear. The Age of Dragons was truly over, replaced by an age where power flowed from loyalty and alliance, rather than supernatural authority. The economic disruption caused by the rebellion and its aftermath was severe, but ultimately liberating, as the rigid structures that had governed trade and commerce under Targaryen rule gave way to more flexible arrangements. The great houses that had once been merely subjects of the Iron Throne now became partners in governance, their cooperation essential to the stability and prosperity of the realm. The mercantile classes that had been constrained by royal monopolies found new opportunities for profit and expansion. The religious implications of the Targaryen fall were equally significant, as the faith of the Seven was freed from the uncomfortable accommodation it had maintained with a dynasty that practiced incest and claimed divine right. The new royal house, drawn from the ancient Andal nobility, represented a return to more traditional religious values and customs. The Septons, who had once been forced to justify Targaryen exceptionalism, could now preach a simpler message of moral law and divine justice. As the realm adjusted to life under a new dynasty, the legacy of the Mad King served as a constant reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the importance of limiting royal authority. The lessons learned from Aerys II's reign would influence Westerosi political thought for generations, shaping the relationship between crown and nobility in ways that made future tyranny more difficult to establish. The wheel of history had turned once again, crushing beneath it a dynasty that had once seemed eternal and invincible. The crown that Robert Baratheon claimed through right of conquest sat heavy upon his head, weighed down not by gold and jewels, but by the ghost of the woman he could never save, and the burden of ruling a kingdom he had never truly wanted. A great warrior who had shattered the Targaryen dynasty with his warhammer found that governing was a far more complex challenge than warfare, requiring patience and attention to detail that his restless nature could barely tolerate. The Iron Throne that had been forged by dragon fire cut him as it had cut so many kings before. But these wounds were nothing compared to the deeper pain that Lyanna Stark's memory carved into his heart. The marriage between Robert and Cersei Lannister, arranged to bind the new dynasty to the wealth and power of Castelli Rock, represented both the political necessities and personal tragedies that defined the reign. Robert had loved only one woman in his life, and she was dead, making any subsequent marriage a matter of duty rather than affection. Cersei, beautiful and intelligent, but proud and ambitious, found herself wed to a man who called her by another woman's name in their marriage bed. The union that should have been a source of strength for both house and kingdom became instead a wellspring of resentment and mutual contempt. The children born of this troubled marriage inherited both the throne's burdens and their parents' dysfunction. Growing up in a royal household where love was scarce and trust was even rarer, Prince Joffrey, golden-haired and green-eyed like his mother, showed early signs of the cruelty that would later define his character. While Princess Mila and Prince Tommen seemed to embody the gentler virtues that their elder brother lacked. The royal family that should have provided stability and continuity for the new dynasty instead became a source of weakness and future conflict. The Greyjoy rebellion that erupted during the 10th year of Robert's reign provided the king with a welcome opportunity to return to the battlefield where he felt most at home. The Ironborn Lord Balon Greyjoy's attempt to restore the independence of the Iron Islands was crushed with swift efficiency, demonstrating that the new royal house could project military power as effectively as its predecessor. The Siege of Pike became the last great military triumph of Robert's reign, showing the kingdom that their warrior king had lost none of his prowess with hammer and sword. The fostering of Theon Greyjoy at Winterfell following his father's defeat represented the kind of wise policy that characterized the best aspects of Robert's reign. Rather than simply executing the rebels or ruling through fear, the crown chose to bind former enemies through personal relationships and shared interests. The young Ironborn Lord grew up among the Starks, learning the values of honor and loyalty that had made the North the backbone of Robert's rebellion, while serving as a living reminder of the costs of defying royal authority. The peace that settled over Westeros during the middle years of Robert's reign was deeper and more enduring than anything the realm had known since the early days of Targaryen rule. The great houses that had spent centuries feuding with their neighbors found common cause in supporting a monarchy that respected their traditional rights while providing effective central authority. Trade flourished as never before, while the arts and learning experienced a renaissance that rivaled the greatest periods of the past. The tournaments that Robert loved became venues where the kingdom's elite could compete and mingle, forging relationships that strengthened the realm's unity. Yet, even as the kingdom prospered, the king himself grew increasingly dissatisfied with the constraints of rule and the burdens of responsibility. The young warrior who had dreamed of glory on the battlefield found himself trapped behind a desk, forced to listen to endless discussions of trade agreements and tax policy when he longed to be hunting in the forests of the Stormlands. His weight increased along with his drinking, while his legendary strength began to fade as years of excess took their toll on his once magnificent physique. The death of Jon Arryn in the final year of Robert's reign marked the end of an era and the beginning of the crisis that would ultimately destroy the kingdom's hard-won peace. The Hand who had served as father figure, chief minister, and wise counselor left behind a vacuum that no one seemed capable of filling. His final words, muttered on his deathbed about the seed being strong, hinted at the dangerous secrets he had uncovered in his final months. Knowledge that would die with him and leave the realm vulnerable to the chaos that was coming. Robert's decision to travel north to Winterfell and offer the position of Hand to his old friend Ned Stark represented both his instinctive wisdom in choosing capable advisors and his tragic inability to see the larger forces that were already in motion. The reunion between the two men, who had been closer than brothers during the rebellion, was bittersweet, marked by the passage of time and the weight of accumulated sorrows. Neither man could have imagined that their meeting would set in motion the events that would tear the kingdom apart and bring an end to the peace they had both worked so hard to build. The hunt that would claim Robert's life began as a celebration of friendship and a brief escape from the burdens of kingship, but it became instead the final chapter in the story of a man who had won everything he thought he wanted, only to discover that victory brought its own forms of suffering. The boar that gored him in the woods near King's Landing was just an animal following its instincts, but the wounds it inflicted would prove fatal, not just to the king, but to the stability of the entire realm. As Robert lay dying in the Red Keep, surrounded by the symbols of power he had never truly wanted, the kingdom he had built through force of arms and strength of character began to fracture along the fault lines that had always existed beneath its peaceful surface. The great lords who had united to overthrow one dynasty now prepared to fight each other for control of the crown, while the common people who had prospered under his rule faced the prospect of another devastating civil war. The reign that had begun with such promise ended in tragedy and foreboding as the wheel of history prepared to turn once again. The peace that Robert had given Westeros was about to be shattered, replaced by a conflict that would make the wars of his youth seem small by comparison. The Game of Thrones was entering a new and more deadly phase, one where the stakes would be higher and the costs more terrible than any previous generation had imagined. The execution of Eddard Stark in the shadow of the Great Sept of Bor was the spark that ignited a conflagration across the Seven Kingdoms, transforming political maneuvering into open warfare that would consume a generation and leave the realm forever changed. The sight of Ice, the ancient Valyrian steel sword of House Stark, falling upon the neck of the most honorable man in Westeros, sent shockwaves through every corner of the kingdom. Lords who had been content to play the Game of Thrones through whispers and alliances suddenly found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that would demand everything they possessed. King Joffrey's decision to order the execution against the advice of his mother and the small council revealed the dangerous unpredictability that would characterize his brief reign. The boy king who ascended the Iron Throne at 13 possessed all of his mother's cruelty and none of her cunning, making decisions based on impulse and spite rather than political calculation. His golden crown sat atop a head filled with sadistic fantasies and delusions of absolute power, while his green eyes reflected the madness that seemed to run in both sides of his true heritage. The North's response was swift and devastating, as Robb Stark called his banners and marched south with an army of 30,000 men seeking justice for his father's murder. The young Wolf King, barely 16 years old, proved to possess a natural genius for military strategy that reminded veterans of battles long past. His victories at Oxcross and the Whispering Wood demonstrated that the old ways of warfare still had power when wielded by someone who understood both honor and necessity. The sight of his direwolf, Grey Wind, fighting alongside northern soldiers became the stuff of legend, inspiring his own troops while striking terror into his enemies. Stannis Baratheon's claim to the Iron Throne was based on the iron certainty of law and legitimacy. As Robert's younger brother possessed the strongest legal right to the crown after Joffrey's true parentage was revealed, the Master of Dragonstone had spent years in his brother's shadow, serving faithfully but without recognition, his rigid sense of duty earning him respect but not love. His alliance with the Red Priestess, Melisandre, brought him power beyond anything he had previously commanded, but at a price that would corrupt both his cause and his soul. The shadow that Melisandre birthed in the caves beneath Storm's End was an abomination that violated the natural order of life and death. Yet, it achieved what conventional siege warfare could not. The murder of Renly Baratheon by his brother's dark magic eliminated the most charismatic claimant to the throne, while demonstrating the terrible forces that the Red God's servants could unleash. The sight of Renly's corpse, bearing wounds that no earthly weapon could have inflicted, shattered his great army and sent thousands of knights fleeing into the night. Renly's death was perhaps the greatest tragedy of the war's early phase, as the Lord of Storm's End possessed the combination of political skill, personal charm, and military resources that might have ended the conflict quickly and bloodlessly. His vision of a realm ruled through consensus rather than fear represented a different path for Westeros, one where the lessons of Robert's rebellion could have been applied to create a more just and stable form of government. His murder by supernatural means showed that the Game of Thrones had entered a new phase where ancient powers and forgotten magics would play increasingly important roles. The Battle of Blackwater Bay became the decisive engagement of the war's first phase, as Stannis' attempt to take King's Landing by storm met the wildfire trap that Tyrion Lannister had prepared with the help of the Pyromancer's Guild. The green flames that consumed half of Stannis' fleet were a deliberate echo of the Mad King's final plot, turning the Baratheon pretender's strength against him in a spectacular conflagration. The sight of ships burning on the river with an unnatural fire reminded everyone present of the dangerous legacy that the Targaryens had left behind. The arrival of Tywin Lannister and his Tyrell allies at the battle's climax saved the capital and the young king, but it also demonstrated the political realignments that were reshaping the kingdom's power structure. The alliance between Lion and Rose, sealed by the betrothal of Joffrey to Margaery Tyrell, brought together the wealth of Castasterly Rock and the agricultural abundance of the Reach in a combination that no other faction could match. The Hand's chain that stretched across Blackwater Bay became a symbol of Lannister ingenuity, while the broken ships that littered the river bottom testified to the costs of challenging their authority. The Red Wedding at the Twins represented the nether of honor in Westerosi politics, as guest right and sacred hospitality were violated in service of political expediency. The murder of Robb Stark, his mother Catelyn, and most of the northern leadership under Walder Frey's roof was orchestrated by Tywin Lannister, but carried out by men who valued revenge above honor. The sight of Grey Wind's head sewn onto his master's body became a symbol of the war's brutality and the death of the old codes that had once governed noble behavior. The psychological impact of the Red Wedding extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as the violation of guest right sent shockwaves through every corner of Westerosi society. The common people, who had witnessed the breakdown of honor among their betters, began to question all forms of authority, while the great houses realized that the old rules no longer protected anyone from the consequences of political miscalculation. The psalms that emerged from the massacre were not celebrations of victory, but laments for a lost age of chivalry and honor. King Joffrey's death at his own wedding feast provided a moment of poetic justice that satisfied few and solved nothing. As the boy king's cruelty was replaced by the more subtle but equally dangerous ambitions of those who had orchestrated his demise. The strangler poison that killed him worked slowly and publicly, ensuring that his final moments were as undignified as his brief reign had been brutal. The crown passed to his younger brother Tommen, a gentle boy who would serve as a puppet for the various factions seeking to control the Iron Throne. The rise of the Faith militant during this period represented a response to the chaos and moral decay that had infected the realm's leadership, as the common people sought spiritual authority to replace the failed secular powers. The High Sparrow who led this movement was a man of genuine piety, whose simple message of justice and redemption resonated with those who had suffered under the nobles' wars. The armed septons, who enforced his will, represented a return to an earlier era when the faith had possessed its own military power and political independence. Stannis Baratheon's march north to the Wall demonstrated both his strategic vision and his growing desperation, as the self-proclaimed king sought new allies among the outcasts and misfits of the Night's Watch. His intervention in the battle against the Wildling army showed that he still possessed the military skills that had made him Robert's most trusted general, while his recognition of the threat beyond the Wall revealed an understanding of larger forces that his rivals lacked. The burning of his daughter Shireen as a sacrifice to the Red God marked the complete corruption of his cause and the abandonment of everything he had once claimed to represent. The liberation of Slaver's Bay by Daenerys Targaryen across the Narrow Sea added a new dimension to the conflict, as the last scion of the Dragon Kings began her own campaign to reclaim her birthright. Her dragons, the first seen in the world for over a century, represented both a return to the old Targaryen power and a new form of warfare that could reshape the balance of forces across both continents. The sight of Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion soaring over the pyramids of Meereen served notice that the Age of Dragons was returning, whether the current occupants of the Iron Throne were ready or not. The northern resistance that emerged from the ashes of Stark defeat showed that some flames could not be easily extinguished, as loyal bannermen like the Mormonts and Umbers continued to fight in the name of their fallen kings. The phrase "the North remembers" became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept Southern rule. While the prospect of Jon Snow's return from the Wall offered hope for eventual revenge against those who had orchestrated the Red Wedding, as the war entered its final phase, the realm lay broken and exhausted, its population decimated by years of conflict and its institutions corrupted by the moral compromises that survival had demanded. The Game of Thrones had claimed kings and commoners alike, leaving behind a kingdom that bore little resemblance to the peaceful realm that Robert Baratheon had once ruled. The wheel of history was grinding toward another turn, carrying with it the promise of either redemption or final destruction for the seven kingdoms of Westeros. The pea that burned on the Dothraki Sea under the Red Comet's baleful light was meant to honor a fallen hell, but it became instead the crucible that would forge a new age of fire and blood. Daenerys Targaryen, the exiled princess who had lost everything but her name and her dragon eggs, walked into those flames as a grieving widow and emerged as the mother of dragons. The three petrified eggs that had been wedding gifts became living creatures of legend, their wings casting shadows that would eventually darken the skies over 2 continents. The dragons that hatched from stone and flame were small at first, no larger than cats, their scales soft and their fire weak. Drogon, black as night, with scarlet eyes and wings, was named for the Khaleesi's dead husband and would grow to become the largest and most willful of the 3. Regal, green and bronze with golden eyes, carried the name of Prince Rhaegar and possessed a temperament as complex as the brother Daenerys had never known. Viserion cream and gold, with the disposition closest to his namesake's cruelty, completed the trinity that would restore dragon fire to a world that had forgotten its power. The miracle of their birth was witnessed by only a handful of survivors from Khal Drogo's Khalasar. But word of the dragon spread across the Dothraki Sea like wildfire. The Horse Lords, who had once dismissed the Pale Queen as just another conquered prize, now spoke her name with reverence and fear. She was no longer merely Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, but Daenerys Unburnt, the Silver Queen whose children breathed fire, and whose destiny stretched beyond the grasslands to the great cities of the East. The long journey across the red waste that followed tested both the dragons and their mother, as the small band of survivors sought refuge in lands that few Dothraki had ever seen. The desert that had swallowed countless caravans and armies welcomed the Dragon Queen, perhaps recognizing in her something that belonged to an older and more dangerous world. The dragons learned to hunt in those harsh lands, their prey ranging from lizards and snakes to the occasional trader who wandered too far from the established routes. Kor, the greatest city that ever was or will be, according to its inhabitants, opened its gates to the mother of dragons with the mixture of avarice and curiosity that characterized all merchant princes. The Corrin had heard rumors of the dragons, but seeing them in person was a revelation that sent tremors through their council chambers and counting houses. The creatures that had once brought old Valyria to the height of its power were walking through their gardens and perching on their balconies, turning legend into reality with every beat of their wings. The House of the Undying, that sinister tower where the warlocks of Kay practiced their ancient arts, became the site of Daenerys's first great trial as a dragon queen. The visions that assaulted her in those twisted halls showed her glimpses of past and future, of the Iron Throne she had never seen, and the burning throne room where her father had died. The dragons that rescued her from the warlock's trap announced to the world that the age of magic was returning, and that those who sought to use the Mother of Dragons for their own purposes did so at their peril. The conquest of Slaver's Bay began not with grand strategy, but with a simple moral imperative, as Daenerys found herself unable to ignore the suffering of those who toiled in chains while their masters lived in luxury. The city of Astapor, with its pyramid-topped temples and its fighting pits filled with unsullied warriors, represented everything that was wrong with the old order. The dragons that had seemed like mere curiosities in Ka revealed their true power when Drogon bathed the good masters in dragonfire, turning their golden pyramids into furnaces and their slave pens into ash. The liberation of the Unsullied was achieved through cunning as much as force, as Daenerys traded one of her dragons for an army, only to reveal that the bond between dragon and dragon rider could not be bought or sold. The sight of 8,000 eunuch warriors kneeling before their new queen, while Astapol burned behind them, announced that a new power had risen in the east. One that combined the legendary might of old Valyria with a revolutionary vision of justice and freedom. Yonkai and Meereen fell in turn as the dragons grew larger and more formidable, their wingspans expanding as their hunger for flesh and fire increased. The Yellow City's surrender without a siege showed that the reputation of Dragonfire could be as effective as the flames themselves, while Meereen's determined resistance required all three dragons working in concert to breach its walls. The sight of the Great Pyramid of Meereen, crowned with Targaryen banners, marked the establishment of the first Targaryen seat of power since the fall of the dynasty in Westeros. The challenges of ruling proved more complex than the conquest itself, as Daenerys discovered that liberating slaves was easier than integrating them into a functioning society. The freedmen who looked to her as their mother and protector had spent their lives in bondage, knowing only how to serve and obey. The former masters, who remained in the city, chafed under the new order while plotting its overthrow, their hatred burning as hot as dragon fire, but far more subtle in its expression. The dragons themselves became both a source of strength and a growing problem as they matured beyond their mother's ability to fully control them. Drogon's attack on a shepherd's child forced Daenerys to confront the reality that her children were predators as well as symbols of liberation, creatures of instinct and appetite that could not be reasoned with or restrained by moral considerations. The decision to chain Rhaegal and Viserion in the depths of the Great Pyramid was perhaps the most painful choice she had ever made, trading their freedom for the safety of her people. The Sons of the Harpy insurgency that plagued Meereen's streets showed that Dragonfire could destroy an army in open battle, but could not root out enemies who hid among the civilian population. The former masters and their supporters waged a campaign of terror and assassination that turned every shadow into a potential threat and every freedman into a possible collaborator. The dragons that had conquered cities proved less effective against opponents who struck in darkness and melted away before retribution could find them. The fighting pits that Daenerys had closed in her campaign against slavery became a symbol of the compromises that ruling required as political necessity forced her to reopen institutions she found morally repugnant. The gladiatorial combat that the Marinese elite demanded as their price for cooperation represented everything the Dragon Queen opposed. Yet her advisors convinced her that some concessions were necessary to maintain peace. The decision to attend the Great Games herself was intended as a gesture of reconciliation, but became instead the stage for her most dramatic demonstration of power. Drogon's return to the fighting pit, drawn by the scent of blood and the roar of the crowd, marked a turning point in both Daenerys's reign and her relationship with her children. The Black Dragon's rampage through the arena and his subsequent flight with his mother clinging to his back showed the world that the bond between Targaryen and dragon was stronger than chains or political considerations. The image of the Silver Queen disappearing into the sky on Dragon Bend before she had even landed, inspiring songs and stories that would spread across both continents. The Dothraki Khalasar that found Daenerys alone in the Grass Sea after Drogon's flight could not have known they were witnessing the beginning of their own conquest. The widow of Khal Drogo, who returned to claim leadership of all the horse tribes, brought with her powers that no Khalid had ever possessed, and a vision that stretched far beyond the traditional boundaries of Dothraki ambition. The burning of the Dahkali and the Khalaju would have enslaved her, marked the beginning of a new kind of horde, one united not just by strength, but by loyalty to the Dragon Queen. The sight of Daenerys emerging unburnt from the flames that consumed the sacred city of Vae Dothrak, with every Dothraki warrior kneeling before her in the firelight, announced that the most dangerous phase of her campaign was about to begin. The 100,000 horsemen, who now called her Khessi, represented the largest army that had ever been assembled under a single banner, while the dragons that had grown to full size during her absence in the east were ready to carry fire and blood across the narrow sea. The ships that would carry this great host westward were already gathering in the harbors of Meereen and Volantis, their holds prepared for horses and dragons alike. The wheel of history was turning once again, carrying the last Targaryen back toward the Iron Throne that her ancestors had forged and her father had lost. The Game of Thrones was about to enter its final phase, where fire and blood would determine not just who ruled, but what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of the old. The wall that had stood for 8,000 years as humanity's shield against the darkness finally fell, not to siege engines or dragonfire, but to the very power it had been built to contain. The ancient barrier of ice and magic, raised by Bran the Builder, with the help of giants and the children of the forest, crumbled before the blue flames of an undead dragon. Its destruction, marking the end of the longest peace the world had ever known. The collapse sent tremors through the earth that were felt as far south as Winterfell, while the roar of falling ice echoed across the frozen wasteland like the death cry of hope itself. Viserion, the dragon that had once soared through warm skies above the pyramids of Meereen, now flew on rotting wings through the perpetual winter that followed the Night King's army. The blue fire that poured from his throat was cold as the void between stars, a corruption of dragon flame that burned away life itself, rather than merely destroying flesh and stone. The sight of a dragon serving the forces of death was an abomination that violated the natural order. Yet it was also a terrible demonstration of the Night King's power to corrupt and command even the mightiest creatures. The Night King himself rode upon the undead dragon's back, a figure of crystalline ice and ancient malice, whose very presence turned the air to frost and the ground to permafrost. He was the first of the White Walkers, the original weapon that the children of the forest had created in their desperation to defeat the first men, but he had long since transcended his creator's intentions. The crown of ice that adorned his head was not a symbol of earthly kingship, but a mark of dominion over death itself, authority that extended to every corpse that had ever drawn breath. The army that poured through the broken wall was beyond counting, a tide of the dead that stretched from horizon to horizon under the green glow of the aurora that danced perpetually in the northern sky. Wights that had once been men, women, and children stumbled forward with blue flames burning in their empty sockets, while fallen horses carried skeletal riders whose spears dripped with ice. Giants moved among them like walking mountains, their massive forms animated by the same cold magic that gave purpose to the smallest reanimated child. Winterfell, the ancient seat of House Stark and the heart of the North, became the last bastion of the living. As the great and small houses of Westeros united in the face of extinction, the castle's walls, which had been built to withstand human enemies, offered little protection against foes who felt no pain and knew no fear. The crypts beneath the castle, where generations of Stark lords lay in stone tombs with iron swords across their laps, became battlegrounds as the dead rose to fight the living in the very heart of the stronghold. Jon Snow, revealed at last as Aegon Targaryen and rightful heir to the Iron Throne, stood with Longclaw in his hand as the forces of ice and fire prepared for their final confrontation. The bastard of Winterfell, who had found his true heritage in the shadow of the wall, now faced the enemy that had haunted his dreams since childhood. Beside him stood Daenerys Targaryen, the aunt he had unknowingly loved, her surviving dragons breathing true fire against the tide of unnatural cold that swept down from the north. The Battle of Winterfell raged through the longest night since the Age of Heroes, as living fought dead in a struggle that would determine the fate of all humanity. The dragon glass weapons that had been forged in the fires of Dragonstone cut through whites like scythe through wheat, while Valyrian steel sang as it cleaved through the supernatural ice that armored the White Walkers. The sight of Serra Jorah Mormont falling while defending his queen, of Theon Greyjoy dying to protect Bran Stark, of Lyanna Mormont bringing down a white giant with her final breath, became the stuff of legend. Even as the battle raged, the dead seemed endless, rising again and again. No matter how many times they were cut down, their numbers swelling with each fallen defender who joined their ranks. A living found themselves fighting not just the army of the dead, but their own fallen friends and family members, forced to destroy beloved faces that had been animated by malevolent purpose. The psychological toll of this horror was almost as devastating as the physical carnage, as hardened warriors broke under the strain of killing those they had once loved. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven who held the memory of the world within his consciousness, served as bait to draw the Night King into the open. The young man who had once climbed the walls of Winterfell now sat motionless in his wheeled chair, his consciousness soaring through time and space, while his body remained vulnerable to the approaching darkness. The ancient grudge between the Night King and the three-eyed raven stretched back to the dawn of the world, when the children of the forest had first created their terrible weapon. Arya Stark, the girl who had become no one before reclaiming her identity, struck the blow that saved humanity from eternal darkness. The Valyrian steel dagger that had once been used in an attempt to murder Bran became the instrument of the Night King's destruction. As the trained assassin materialized from shadow to drive the blade into the ancient evil's heart, the Night King's destruction sent shockwaves through his entire army, as every White and White Walker crumbled to dust in the space of heartbeats. The silence that followed the collapse of the army of the dead was perhaps more profound than the noise of battle that had preceded it. The aurora that had danced in the northern sky faded away, while the unnatural cold that had gripped the land began to lift for the first time in months. The survivors who stood among the piles of bones and rusted weapons could hardly believe that the threat that had hung over humanity for 8,000 years had been ended by a single thrust of Valyrian steel. The cost of victory was staggering, as half the defenders of Winterfell lay dead in the castle's yards and halls. The great houses of the north had been decimated, their proud banners torn and bloodied, their ancient lineages ended in a single night of horror. The common soldiers who had stood against the tide of death were mourned alongside the great lords, their sacrifice recognized as equal to any noble deed in the long history of Westeros. The crypts of Winterfell, where the dead Starks had risen to fight their own descendants, were blessed and sealed by the surviving Septons and Red Priests who had witnessed the battle. The iron swords that had been displaced from the stone hands of ancient lords were reforged into commemorative weapons, while new tombs were prepared for those who had fallen in humanity's final victory over the darkness. The dragons that had survived the battle, scarred and wounded, but still magnificent, became symbols of the triumph of fire over ice. Drogon and Rhaegal had proven that the flame of life could overcome even the cold of death. Their dragonfire serving as the light that held back the darkness during the realm's darkest hour. The bond between dragon and rider had been tested in the ultimate crucible and emerged stronger than ever. The Night Watch, whose purpose had been fulfilled with the destruction of the threat they had been founded to guard against, faced an uncertain future as the wall lay broken and their ancient enemy was no more. The men in black, who had taken vows to defend the realm until death, could now consider whether their duty had been completed, or whether new threats would emerge to take the place of the old ones. As dawn finally broke over the battlefield, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of gold and crimson, the survivors began the long process of mourning their dead and rebuilding their world. The long night had ended, not with the coming of a prophesied hero, but with the courage of a young woman who had learned that even the mightiest enemies could fall to a well-placed blade wielded by someone willing to risk everything for those they loved. The wheel of history had turned once more, grinding beneath it an evil that had existed since the dawn of time. The age of ice was ending, but the age of fire was about to begin. As the survivors of humanity's greatest victory prepared to face the more mundane, but no less dangerous challenges of determining who would rule the world they had saved. The victory over the Night King should have united the realm in celebration and gratitude. But instead, it merely cleared the stage for a more intimate and perhaps more tragic conflict. The great enemy that had threatened all humanity was gone, leaving behind the smaller but no less destructive ambitions of those who had survived to claim dominion over the living. The bonds forged in the crucible of the long night proved fragile when tested against the ancient hunger for power that had driven the Game of Thrones for centuries. Daenerys Targaryen, who had sacrificed so much to save a world that had never welcomed her, found herself increasingly isolated as the euphoria of victory faded into the cold reality of politics. The Dragon Queen, who had broken chains across Slaver's Bay, discovered that the lords of Westeros viewed her not as a liberator, but as a foreign conqueror whose dragons and Dothraki followers threatened their traditional way of life. The love she had hoped to find in her ancestral homeland remained elusive, replaced by fear and resentment that no amount of heroism could overcome. The revelation of Jon Snow's true parentage as Aegon Targaryen created a crisis that neither he nor Daenerys could resolve through compromise or negotiation. The bastard of Winterfell, who had never wanted power, found himself the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, while the woman who had spent her life preparing to rule discovered that her claim was secondary to that of the nephew she had come to love. The irony that the Targaryen dynasty's salvation lay in the union of its last two members was overshadowed by the political reality that only one could rule. The march south toward King's Landing became a procession of mounting tension and growing despair as Daenerys felt the tide of loyalty turning against her with each passing mile. The death of Missandei, her closest friend and advisor at the hands of Cersei Lannister's headsman, was a personal blow that struck deeper than any military defeat. The sight of her friend's severed head falling from the walls of the Red Keep filled the Dragon Queen with a fury that burned hotter than dragon fire and consumed what remained at her mercy. King's Landing, the greatest city in Westeros and the seat of Targaryen power for 3 centuries, had become a fortress held by enemies who showed no intention of yielding to the rightful queen's demands. Cersei Lannister, the lioness who had clawed her way to power through cunning and ruthlessness, prepared for a siege that she hoped would break the Dragon Queen's resolve. The city's 1 million inhabitants became unwilling pawns in a game where their lives mattered less than the political advantage their suffering might provide. The bells of surrender that rang across King's Landing as Drogon circled overhead should have marked the end of the war and the beginning of Daenerys' reign. The golden sound that echoed from every septon tower announced that the city was ready to yield, that the bloodshed could end without further loss of life. For a moment, it seemed that wisdom and mercy might prevail over vengeance and fury, that the cycle of violence that had plagued Westeros for generations might finally be broken. But the bells that promised peace became instead the signal for destruction. As something snapped in the mind of the Dragon Queen, who had lost too much and suffered too long, the madness that had claimed her father found new expression in dragon fire turned against innocence. As Drogon's flames swept through streets filled with civilians who had played no part in the wars of kings and queens, the liberation that Daenerys had promised became a holocaust that reduced the ancient city to ash and bone. The destruction of King's Landing was both a strategic triumph and a moral catastrophe, as the Dragon Queen's victory came at the cost of everything she had claimed to represent. The former slaves who had called her mother watched in horror as their liberator became the destroyer of innocence, while the Westerosi lords, who had grudgingly accepted her claim, now saw confirmed their worst fears about Targaryen madness. The Iron Throne sat in a throne room filled with ash, ruling over a capital that had become a graveyard. Jon Snow's discovery of the true extent of Daenerys' destruction forced him to confront the terrible choice between love and duty that had defined the Targaryen dynasty's relationship with power. The woman he loved had become a tyrant whose vision of liberation required the enslavement or elimination of all who opposed her will. A man who had been raised on honor and duty found himself facing the same impossible decision that had once confronted Lannister in this very throne room. The death of Daenerys Targaryen came not in battle against enemies, but through the blade of the man who loved her most, as Jon Snow drove a dagger into her heart while she spoke of the glorious future they would build together. The kiss that preceded the killing was both an act of love and a moment of profound betrayal. As the last Targaryen king took the life of the last Targaryen queen to save the world from her vision of perfect tyranny, Drogon's grief at his mother's death was perhaps the most human moment in the entire tragedy. As the last dragon in the world nudged his fallen rider with his great head before turning his fury upon the Iron Throne itself, the seat of power that had been forged by his ancestors' fire was melted by his flames. The twisted metal, running like water as the symbol of absolute monarchy, was destroyed by the very force that had created it. The dragon's departure, carrying his mother's body toward the sunrise, marked the end of the Age of Dragons and the beginning of something new. The Great Council that assembled in the ruins of King's Landing faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just a city, but an entire system of government from the ashes of the old order. The lords and ladies who had survived the wars of the past generation looked upon the melted remains of the Iron Throne and understood that the old ways of ruling were as dead as the dynasty that had once commanded dragons. The time had come to forge something new from the ruins of the past. Brandon Stark, the three-eyed raven who had sacrificed his humanity to become the living memory of the world, was chosen to rule, not because of his bloodline or his conquests, but because of his unique ability to see beyond the petty ambitions that had driven so much suffering. The broken boy who had once climbed the walls of Winterfell would sit upon a throne of his own making, ruling through wisdom rather than fear, through knowledge rather than force. The decision to grant independence to the North, with Sansa Stark as its queen, recognized the reality that some bonds could not be rebuilt, and some wounds ran too deep to heal. A kingdom that had bled most heavily in the wars of the past generation would go its own way, following the old gods and the old ways under the rule of a queen who had learned statecraft in the hardest possible school. The white dire wolf banners that flew from Winterfell's towers proclaimed that the North remembered and that it would never again kneel to southern kings. Darius Stark's decision to sail west of Westeros represented the adventurous spirit that had survived all the horrors of war and politics. As the young woman who had been forged into a weapon chose to become an explorer instead, the ships that carried her beyond the sunset sailed toward unknown lands where new stories waited to be written, where the Game of Thrones was replaced by the simple human desire to discover what lay beyond the horizon. The small council that gathered in the rebuilt Red Keep to advise the new king represented a new generation of leaders who had been tempered by war and loss, but not broken by it. Tyrion Lannister as Hand, Samuel Tarly as Grand Maester, Sir Davos Seaworth as Master of Ships, each brought their own hard-earned wisdom to the task of rebuilding a kingdom that had nearly destroyed itself in pursuit of power. The wheel that Daenerys had promised to break had indeed been shattered, but not in the way she had envisioned. The Game of Thrones had ended not with the triumph of good over evil, but with the recognition that power itself was the true enemy, that the pursuit of absolute authority inevitably corrupted those who sought it. The new realm that emerged from the ashes would be built on different foundations, where the lessons of the past would guide rather than condemn the future. As spring returned to Westeros for the first time in years, bringing green shoots through the blackened earth of King's Landing and melting the last snows of an endless winter, the survivors of the Great Game began the long work of healing. The songs that would be sung of their deeds would tell of heroes and villains, of love and betrayal, of the price that power extracted from all who sought it, and the hope that could emerge even from the darkest tragedy. In the years that followed the breaking of the wheel, Westeros began to heal from wounds that had seemed too deep to mend. The scattered stones of King's Landing were rebuilt not as monuments to royal power, but as homes for the common people, who had always been the true foundation of the realm. Where once the Red Keep had loomed over the city like a crimson crown, now gardens bloomed in courtyards, where children played among flowers that grew from soil enriched by ash and memory. King Bran the Broken ruled from a throne carved not from the swords of enemies, but from the ironwood of the north, its branches reaching upward like the heart trees that had watched over the realm since the dawn of time. His reign was marked not by conquest or grandeur, but by the quiet work of justice and reconstruction, as the realm learned to govern itself through councils and compromise, rather than the will of a single monarch. The ravens that carried his messages across the seven kingdoms bore words of reconciliation rather than commands of war. The great houses that had once schemed and fought for centuries of advantage now found themselves partners in the greater work of rebuilding civilization from its foundations. The Starks ruled the independent North with wisdom gained through suffering, while the Lannisters sought to redeem their legacy through service rather than dominance. The Tyrells planted new roses in the fertile fields of the Reach, while the Baratheons learned that true strength lay in protection rather than conquest. In the north, Queen Sansa presided over a realm that had chosen its own path, where the old gods watched over their children from the heart trees, and the long winters no longer brought terror, but simply the turning of seasons in their proper order. Winterfell's halls echoed with laughter instead of the clash of swords, while the crypts below held their honored dead in peaceful rest. Their iron swords no longer needed to guard against the darkness. The wall, though broken, was not abandoned, but transformed into something new. The Night's Watch evolved from a military order into a brotherhood of scholars and healers who tended to the needs of the free folk who had settled the lands beyond. The castles that had once been fortresses became schools and libraries, while the ranging that had once sought enemies now explored the mysteries of lands that were no longer forbidden. Beyond the narrow sea, the cities that Daenerys had liberated continued the work she had begun. Though they chose their own paths toward freedom, the former slaves of Slaver's Bay built new lives as free citizens, while the pyramids that had once housed masters now served as schools and hospitals. The dragons were gone, but the memory of liberation lived on in the hearts of those who had broken their own chains. Arya Stark's voyages to the lands west of Westeros brought back tales of wonders that reminded the realm that there were still mysteries to be solved and adventures to be found that did not require conquest or bloodshed. Her ships returned laden, not with gold or slaves, but with knowledge and stories, new crops and healing herbs, proving that exploration could enrich the world without impoverishing others. The faith of the Seven found new purpose in healing rather than judgment. As the Septimans and Scepters, who had once preached about divine justice, learned to tend to the earthly needs of their flocks, the great Sept of Baelor was rebuilt as a hospital and place of learning, where the wounded could heal and the ignorant could learn, where the seven faces of God smiled down upon works of mercy rather than acts of war. The songs that the bards sang in taverns and great halls told stories of the heroes who had saved the world from darkness. But they also celebrated the smaller victories of farmers who fed the hungry, of merchants who traded fairly, of parents who raised their children in peace. The great game that had consumed so many lives gave way to countless smaller games where the stakes were happiness rather than power, love rather than dominance. Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf who had survived through wit when strength would have failed him, found his greatest satisfaction not in the cleverness of his schemes, but in the simple pleasure of governance that served the people rather than the powerful. His reforms to the law codes ensured that justice was available to all rather than just to those who could afford it, while his management of the royal finances proved that prosperity could be built through trade and taxation rather than conquest and plunder. The children who grew up in this new world knew the stories of dragons and White Walkers as legends rather than memories, tales told by the fireside to entertain rather than warnings of real dangers that might return. They played at being knights and queens, but their games ended with laughter rather than tears, with embraces rather than funerals. The seasons turned in their ancient pattern, unmarked by human interference or supernatural threat. Spring brought new growth to lands that had been scorched by dragonfire. Summer blessed the realm with abundance that was shared rather than hoarded. Autumn prepared the people for winters that were measured in months rather than years. And winter itself was welcomed as a time of rest and reflection, rather than feared as a harbinger of death. The misters, who had once served individual lords, now work together to preserve and expand human knowledge. Their chains, no longer symbols of servitude, but of connection to the great work of understanding the world. Their ravens carried not just messages between castles, but news of discoveries and innovations that enriched all the realm, rather than just their immediate masters. Magic, which had returned to the world in fire and ice, settled into gentler forms that healed rather than destroyed. The red priests still tendered their flames, but they burned for warmth and light rather than as weapons of war. The children of the forest emerged from their hiding places to share their ancient wisdom with those who would listen, teaching new ways to live in harmony with the natural world. The Iron Throne was gone, melted by dragon fire, and replaced by something that could not be conquered because it existed in the hearts and minds of free people, rather than as a physical object to be seized. The crown passed not through inheritance or conquest, but through the choice of those who understood that true authority came from service rather than dominance. And in the Godswood of King's Landing, where a harsh tree had been planted in soil that remembered both sorrow and joy, the faces carved in the white bark seemed to smile as they watched over a realm finally at peace. The old gods and the new had found common purpose in protecting rather than conquering, in nurturing rather than commanding. The Game of Thrones was ended, but the greater game of life continued, played not for crowns and castles, but for love and laughter, for the simple joy of watching children grow in safety and prosperity. The wheel that had crushed so many beneath it was broken at last, replaced by the turning of seasons and the cycle of generations, where each new day brought the possibility of wonder rather than the certainty of sorrow. In the end, it was not fire and blood that saved the realm, but the recognition that some victories were worth more than all the Iron Thrones that could ever be forged. The long night was over, the dawn had come, and the world was ready to begin again. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complete timeline of Westeros and Essos. If you've enjoyed these stories of ice and fire, of dragons and dire wolves, of the rise and fall of dynasties, and the eternal human struggle for power and meaning, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the worlds we love. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the gentle turning of wheels that lift rather than crush, and may you wake to dawns that promise hope rather than fear.